what I'd like to do today is to provide you with an economic overview of what's going to happen as we go through the pandemic, and perhaps more importantly, what are going to be the drivers of the recovery from the pandemic, and what are the factors that we need to be looking out for as we try to plan our way both through and beyond the crisis that we currently find ourselves in. The figures that I'm presenting here are figures that were very well trailed in the press over the last week in the United Kingdom. They come from the Bank of England's monetary policy report, which was published on the 8th of May of this year. And basically what the Bank of England have done, firstly, has said that these are not forecasts. What these are a scenario, what they call their central scenario for the UK economy, based upon a number of assumptions that they've made. And I'm going to talk a lot about those assumptions because they're key to our understanding of how the economy is going to evolve in the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months. So we all know that we're in the middle of a very deep recession. And in the first half of this year, it is expected that GDP, or output in the UK economy, will fall by about 30%. For the calendar year of 2020, so that is January 2020 to December 2020, the expectation is that GDP will go down by 15%. So there is some expectation of a slight recovery into the end of this year. And then there is an expectation of quite a significant recovery into 2021, an increase in 15% of GDP. But we have to remember that that increase in 15% is from the trough that we would be in at the end of this year. And then they see a normalization of GDP at around 3% into 2022. The expectation is that unemployment at the end of this year will be pushing 10%. And they make the prediction that if their central scenario were to be fulfilled, that we would revive the level of activity in our economy in the first quarter of 2023 that we enjoyed at the end of 2019. So basically it would take us around 3 years to recover from the recession that we're currently in. But as I said, central to that scenario is a series of assumptions that the Bank of England has made. First of all, and not on my slides, is there is an assumption that there will be no second wave. So if there were a second wave of the pandemic, that would cause those central assumptions to be impacted significantly in a negative way. And therefore the test, track, trace and quarantine that we've all been talking about over the last week, and that the government is trying to put in place as quickly as possible, is massively important, both for the health of our population and also for the health of our economy. One of the central assumptions, though, is what is this pandemic going to do to consumer and business confidence? They made some pretty clear assumptions that consumer and business confidence would be significantly hit this year. The gentleman on the right is John Maynard Keynes, the famous Cambridge economist. And in the depression of the 1930s, Keynes introduced this notion of the paradox of thrift. He said that in recessions, in depressions, what we tend to do is save more and spend less. And by saving more, what we actually do is contribute to the economy not recovering. So it's massively important that consumers become confident, they stop saving, and they start spending. The same is also true of businesses. Businesses worried about their cash flows, worried about the continuance of their organization, tend to rush to cash and they stop investing. And as they stop investing, that means that there is less activity in the economy. So key now as we come out of the depth of the pandemic and into the end of this year is what happens to consumer and business confidence. What we need to see is that consumer and business confidence returning, and then into 2021, businesses to start reinvesting, admittedly from very low levels, and consumers to start going back out into the shops and start buying. So we need to keep a real close eye on consumer and business confidence, and obviously the CIPS market PMI indicators are key indicators of confidence in many sectors of our economy. The government has contributed to this via its, what I've called its demand stabilisation policies. So this is allowing organisations to furlough employees and therefore maintaining employment and also household income. And then the loans and grants that governments have provided to businesses, they're attempting to provide injections of cash into those businesses to make sure that even when their revenues, or those businesses where revenues have collapsed substantially, that they can see themselves through the crisis and be alive, as it were, at a point when the economy recovers. Again, there's going to be a crunch point towards the end of the summer or into autumn where the government has to withdraw some of this support, and we hope that the economy has recovered sufficiently to keep those businesses going, so that what we see is a maintenance of employment, a maintenance of businesses in existence. We don't want to see significant numbers of insolvencies. We don't want to see significant increases in unemployment, as that will then dampen down the recovery. So the end of the year is going to be a crunch point in terms of seeing whether or not these businesses and households can sustain themselves, because the economy is starting to recover in a manner which allows them to be sustained. Another key issue that has not been talked about, but is beginning to be talked about in a wider economic community, is that if we did reach a crunch point at the end of the year and there was significant unemployment and there were significant business failures, then there's an added complexity of a potential financial crisis as people households start to default on their debt and businesses start to default on their loans. So when we see analysis of W's in terms of the shape of the recovery, what they're talking about there is this sort of end of the year crisis where we see increases in unemployment, we see increases in business failure, we see lack of consumer and business confidence causing the economy to go down again. So it's enormously important that we sustain our businesses, we sustain our households through the crisis, and then we start to see the economy recovering. And obviously, if we were to get a vaccine, that would be an enormous contributor to that. Also, we have to be aware that the global economy and activity in the global economy is heavily synchronized. From the UK's perspective, it's important that not only we recover, but those economies that we trade with significantly also need to recover. Now, 60% of UK trade is with the European Union and North America, so it's enormously important that those economies recover and drag everybody up with them, as it were. Malcolm talked about Brexit and the fact that we will Brexit on January the 1st, 2021. As central to the Bank of England's assumptions in the scenario that I put forward to you today is that there is frictionless trade between the UK and the European Union post-January 1, 2021. And then we don't need a resurgence of protectionism. Obviously, the protectionist noises that are being made between the US and China at the moment are unfortunate. But what we do need is we need open and free trade and economies that are synchronized in their recovery, that are recovering together, which will allow us all to come out of this in much better shape. And also, there are issues there with the rich economies of the North, as we used to say. So the rich economies of Western Europe, North America, and China need to provide finance to the weaker economies to see them through the crisis. This is a chart that the Bank of England produced in the report, and it's on page 50. I would implore you to go and read it, because what it looks at is the sectoral impact of the crisis. Now, Malcolm alluded to this briefly in his speech, but on the left-hand side of the screen here, you can see there, as we go up the screen, the sectors are being increasingly impacted by COVID-19 in terms of collapse of demand, On the right-hand side, we see the contribution that those sectors make to the UK economy in terms of total spending in the economy. Now, what we've basically got is 50% of our economy that is defined as staples, so house, water, fuel, food and drink, communications and health services. Basically, they have not been as impacted by the crisis. They're likely to recover. Some of those sectors have actually done well in the crisis. Then we start to move on to areas of consumption that can be delayed. That accounts for about 23%. So recreation and culture goods, purchase of vehicles, we've seen new car purchases go down, furniture and household equipment, clothing. These are all expenditures that we can delay, and obviously we need to see expenditures on those things increasing as we come out of the crisis, and therefore my comments earlier about consumer confidence being important. We've got work-related expenditures around operations of vehicles and travelling to and from work. And then we've seen the social aspects of expenditure that have been heavily hit both by the lockdown, and the danger is that if we come out with a lack of consumer confidence, we don't go back into restaurants, we don't we don't spend money on cultural events and recreation, and obviously we don't travel as much as we have in the past. So we need to think about those sectors. We need to think about the extent to which we're recovering and how those sectors will be impacted. And the more we can start to get that confidence going, start to get those areas of consumption being activated in our economies, then the quicker and the more robustly we will recover. This is something that I got from the Boston Consulting Group, which is now actually saying, so what does it mean for my business in terms of the nature of demand? I know in a podcast that myself and Malcolm did a number of weeks ago, many procurement people are asking themselves the question, you know, what is going to be the nature of demand after the crisis? People talking about this new normal. What essentially they've attempted to do here is to work through, you know, what are the potential implications of people spending more time at home? What's working from home doing in terms of certain demands, eating at home, being entertained at home? What about digital coordination, and what does that mean for certain sectors of the economy? Some sectors of the economy are going to be impacted in the pale green, whereas the brighter green is where the opportunities are. And many organizations now are starting to think about the nature of demand and what that actually means for configuring our businesses. We know that many advanced economies are expected to go into recession. And again, that goes back to my point about a coordinated recovery. And we need to keep an eye on what's happening in those economies where demand for our products is likely to be relatively strong. But then again, going back to Malcolm's point, where we have supply chain relationships, and we need those economies to be active in order for us to be able to produce what it is that we want to produce. And then, you know, this point about consumer confidence, 30 million people in the United States have filed for unemployment in the last 6 weeks. This is going to impact consumer confidence. I've read papers coming out of Harvard this week that actually say this is likely to prolong the recovery. So rather than it being 3 years before we get back to the activity of 2019, some Harvard economists are predicting that for North America, that could be closer to 4.5 or 5 years. So what we need to do is to keep a close eye on these values, see how quickly these numbers are turning around, have a feel for what's happening in those economies that we trade with most robustly in the greatest volume, so that we can start to plan, we can start to take a view on where we think economic recovery is going to occur. Yeah, a question that I keep getting asked is, you know, our governments have engaged in massive amounts of borrowing. I looked at the Bank of England this morning. In May, we did 650 billion pounds worth of quantitative easing. And I keep getting asked the question, you know, is there a limit to how much the government can borrow? Is there a limit to how much money they can print? Well, first of all, if we're creditworthy economies, we can tend to borrow more than economies that are not as creditworthy. And a couple of effects are happening there. International investors, when we get a crisis such as the one that we've got at the moment, will tend to engage in what we call a flee to quality. They will go to those countries that they feel are most likely to be creditworthy. And frankly, they're not looking at return on assets, they're looking at return of assets. So if I lend my money to the UK government, if I lend my money in the EU, if I lend my funds to North America, I'm more likely to get that money back. The second thing that we can do is actually print money. So the Bank of England can buy securities, can buy assets of businesses, they can buy assets of government, they can buy treasury bills and provide the funding by effectively printing money. There is a danger that that causes inflation. Historically, over the last 10 years, it's not tended to do it in terms of consumer price inflation, but it has caused equity price bubbles, it has caused property price bubbles. The third thing that you can do is borrow money on another country's credit rating, hence the cartoon. Essentially, and this is a big debate at the moment inside the European Union, Spain can borrow money on international markets by issuing euro bonds, where essentially they're using the credit rating of Germany to do so. So this is the point about, we need to provide liquidity to recovering economies. We need to provide liquidity to emerging or less robust economies. But if we're going to do that, we need to be clear about the fact that we are doing it by using the credit rating of the stronger economies in the world. And there is a debate, there's been a very robust debate in Europe in recent months about whether or not that should be the case. But the thing that we have to remember is that this is not a one-person game. This is not I win, you lose. In the end, nobody's going to win unless everybody wins. What does that mean? It essentially means that we need to recover from this crisis as a global economy. And by recovering from this crisis as a global economy, it is in our interest. It is in our interest in the United Kingdom to make sure that Europe recovers, to make sure that Latin America recovers. And it's quite interesting to view what the role of China will be in this. China has a vast amount of liquidity. It's an incredibly wealthy economy. That liquidity essentially being loaned around the world to affect the recovery of global economies is not only in the interest of the global economies, it's in the interest of China. So we need major economies, Germany, United Kingdom, US, China, to actually provide the liquidity that is going to allow the global economy to recover. So thank you for your attention. Hopefully what I've tried to provide you with is a whole series of variables that you need to be looking at so that you can start to take a view on how you think the economies that are most important to you and your business are likely to recover. There is a vast amount of data out there. Don't look at the headline data, try to look at the assumptions that underlie that data and try to look at how those variables which support the headline data are actually moving, and on that basis start to develop your own view of how you think economies are going to evolve out of this crisis.